I'm particularly happy to hear that my book compares positively to Toronto undergraduate prose. Anyway, so I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk here. So my lecture is going to be a little bit of an experiment, because it's really the first time that I'm talking about this project in public, and I'm talking about something that lies outside my, let's say, normal, academic area of expertise. But I've been working on this family history or family memoir for quite a while, 5-6 years. It's not at all an easy project. It's moving along slowly. It's difficult to find the right form for it. Anyway, so it's still not done, but I'm going to talk about some aspects of it today. Now, as a philosopher by background, by training, I ask myself, of course, why am I concerned with something so ephemeral, so non-consequential as myself and my family, right? If you look at it from the perspective of the universe or from the perspective of eternity, as Spinoza might say, it seems that these are, really trifles, these are really unimportant things, myself and my family. Shouldn't I be reflecting on philosophy's perennial questions? What kinds of things exist, what the nature of knowledge is, what a good life consists in, what a just society consists in, and so on. Now, I'm not going to answer this question here today, but I do think that I have finally figured out what the problem actually is that this family memoir, family history is supposed to solve. And this was not something that was clear to me from the start, so it's something that emerged during the work on this project. So I'm going to talk about this problem that this memoir or history is supposed to solve. So my family had been moving back and forth between Germany and Brazil over 3 generations, dodging dictators on either side of the Atlantic. First, the Nazis in Germany, then Brazilian generals following a military coup in the 1960s. So this is this military dictatorship that the current president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, is so fond of. So you may have heard of it in that context. So I grew up between Germany and Brazil in the 1970s and 80s in a family that faced its fair share of challenges. And for me, a big one was that I couldn't quite figure out where I belong. So I'd been left by this history with 2 hyphens, German hyphen, Brazilian hyphen, Jewish, German, Brazilian, Jewish, and these 2 hyphens didn't add up to anything coherent. The barriers I ran into varied: cultural, historical, religious. I was too German for Brazil, too Jewish for Germany, not Jewish enough for Israel. Like a kind of puzzle piece that keeps turning up in the wrong puzzle. I felt that I was always somehow in the wrong puzzle. Now you might ask, why bother with these local attachments in the first place, right? Can we not just become citizens of the world? Sounds cool and trendy, sure, but can we really leave our contingent self behind? Now, I've tried out different forms of cosmopolitanism, in particular the idea of a community of philosophers united across time and space from ancient Greece to the present by a shared ideal of seeking the truth. So a kind of community of contemplation across time and space. But on scrutiny, these communities didn't quite convince me either, and so instead of becoming a world citizen, I was still stuck between my 3 stools: Germany, Brazil, Israel. So in the end, I chose a different path to tackle these hyphens. Rather than trying to fit into this or that community, parochial or cosmopolitan, I pieced together my own puzzle, the twists and turns of my family history, and how it shaped me. And this narrative, that's the hope, is supposed to become the home that I wasn't able to find on the map. So a home that is not really tied to a geographic location, to a religious tradition, or a cultural context, but that emerges from the narrative itself, that emerges from the story itself. So this is a very brief sketch of the project, the motivation of the project. Now, let me try to explain a little more how this feeling of displacement that is at the core of this project emerged that this family history that I've been writing is meant to cure, right? So that's what I'm going to focus on in the remainder of this talk, this feeling of displacement and how it actually emerged. So Germany is my paradise lost. Lost twice, first as a home and then as a place of longing. Not Germany in the abstract, of course, but Mariafehn, a rather dreary small town in North Rhine-Westphalia. It's not really a small town even, it's really a village, about 2,000 inhabitants. In 1970, my parents came to Germany as political refugees from Brazil's military dictatorship, one of many repressive regimes in Latin America that the US backed to fight communism after the Cuban Revolution. A year later, I was born, so in 1971, followed by 3 siblings. And now my parents, they really didn't want to stand out, and they certainly didn't want us, the children, to stand out or feel different. So they made a very deliberate effort to raise us as Germans. After finishing their studies in the nearby university town of Münster, my father got his first job as a math teacher at Mariafehn's Catholic Gymnasium. So gymnasium is sort of a fancy high school in Germany. There was a shortage of math teachers at the time, so the patres who ran this school couldn't be picky. Making a virtue out of necessity, they advertised my father as the Israelite on staff in the yearly calendar for the school community to show off how tolerant they were. Wasn't Jesus a Jew? Frau Kober, our neighbors, the wife of the history teacher, asked my parents in search for common ground. Our timing was lucky. Just a few years earlier, at the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church had actually reversed its attitude to the Jews, right? So in the 1960s, from enemy to brother, from Christ murderer to fellow child of Abraham. So there was really a profound cultural shift in the Catholic Church, which made it possible for my father to actually be employed at that school. Now, my parents tried to be discreet about their Brazilian Jewish and communist background. A person who had known them could have identified, discerned relics from various layers of the past in our Mariafehn home, the home where we lived. The suitcase my father got at his bar mitzvah, the only one they had time to pack when they left Sao Paulo, or the poster of Charlie Chaplin on wheels from the Cuban Film Institute, which they'd bought during the 6 months they spent in Havana in the late 1960s, or the paintings of horses, flowers, and birds that my mother's father had brought from trips to China as a delegate of Brazil's Communist Party. But in our new German life, these objects no longer had meaning. Brazil as a whole dropped out of the picture, except for a few LPs, books, and the background noise of my parents speaking to each other in Portuguese. All of this was replaced with a hodgepodge of German customs that my parents picked up from neighbors and friends. These included, in no particular order, preparing lavish Sunday breakfasts with boiled eggs, Brötchen, and orange juice, celebrating the harvest according to Mariafehn's rural traditions, Erntedankfest, so a kind of Thanksgiving, sewing rustic farmer shirts, Bauernhemden, after designs from our neighbor Frau Kober, baking Christmas cookies, Husarenkrapfen, Nusstaler, Vanille, Kipferl, based on recipes from a friend in Münster. I still get a box on occasion, they're actually delicious. Decorating Easter eggs with watercolors, making jams and compotes from local berries, and so on. In my childhood photo album, there's a picture of my mother and me that my father decided to enlarge. We smile happily. She wears a dirndl, I ornate Lederhosen, leather trousers, which are these iconic symbols of Heimat, of home in Germany, especially in the south of Germany. You can almost hear the cowbells ringing. Now, this effort that my parents made to fit in contributed much to a happy childhood. From the sandbox to elementary school, Mariafehn really was home. Although grandparents would fly in and out from someplace far away, the visits didn't disturb my sense of belonging. Fond memories include steering Playmobil vessels across the bathtub, launching Lego rockets from the kitchen table, playing cowboy and Indian in the little forest behind our house, turning the trunk of a fallen tree into a pirate ship, a submarine, a skyrocket, watching Biene Maya and Heidi on TV, and unpacking my Schultüte, the cone-shaped paper bag filled with toys and candy that German children get on their first day of school. I also voraciously read the stories that shape every German boy's imagination. From Winnetou, the noble chief of the Apaches, and Old Shatterhand, his white brother-in-arms, the protagonists of Karl May's hugely popular Wild West novels. I'm actually reading the first volume now to my daughter in Montreal, who is 10. To Erich Kästner's Emil and his gang of children detectives pursuing the wicked bank robber Max Grundeis. After watching Winnetou, this chief of the Apaches, die in the last episode of the story's 1960s TV adaptation, he saves Old Shatterhand by taking a bullet in his place. My friends and I met on the nearby playground, our eyes red from crying. That was about as tragic as it got. On the whole, these were really uneventful times, certainly in Maria Feen. The generation I was born into was later dubbed Generation Golf, as exciting and glamorous as a middle-class Volkswagen. Their grandparents may have been Nazis, and their parents, so the 68ers, the 68er, rebels traumatized by the past, but my cohort wanted to consume, have fun, and stay out of trouble. This unencumbered Maria Feen life offered what 2 generations earlier my Jewish forebears had so much yearned for, a sense of being truly at home in Germany. But when an amnesty for Brazilians in exile was issued in 1979, so I was 8 by then, my parents decided it was time to return to São Paulo, their hometown. And so, just like that, my German life was over. In 1980, we packed up 4 small kids and 8 big suitcases that my father heaved into the train to Genoa in Italy. In Genoa, we boarded a big white cruise ship, the Enrico C. The 2 weeks we spent on the Atlantic were, of course, a big adventure for a 9-year-old boy. With my brothers, I would play hide and seek between the decks, or after a nice sailor allowed us into one of the lifeboats, we would imagine how we would weather a hurricane. My mother's black face paint turned us into Negerlein, little black kids for the costume ball. So I don't know if this disqualifies me from running for prime minister in Canada. But I was 9, not 29, when this happened. We will see. As we crossed the equator, I got my first sip of champagne. Only when we arrived did it hit me that my parents' return from exile spelled exile for me. Suddenly, my beloved Maria Feen world shrunk to a small, small spot very far away. We disembarked in Santos, which is the port for São Paulo, just as my father's mother, Erika, and her sister Hannelore had done 40 years earlier, before. I was only a couple of years younger than my grandmother had been, and probably felt even more alienated. At least she'd been a real immigrant. My family was Brazilian, so I was sort of thrust into this big otherness without a buffer. We had come home, hadn't we? Well, I had not. I wasn't used to being showered with hugs and kisses, and couldn't understand why it was polite to arrive half an hour late when we were invited to someone's house. One of my aunts on my mother's Catholic side of the family spent hours in front of a crucifix imploring Christ to help my cousin get into medical school. To cover all her bases, she instructed her maid to make offerings to Afro-Brazilian deities as well. Exu, Ogum, Xangô, Iemanjá, right? So the deities that slaves brought from Africa to Brazil to make sure he would really get in. Her family owned a chácara, a luxurious country house with swimming pool and tennis court, where we would sometimes spend the weekend surrounded by scores of uncles, aunts, and cousins whose precise relation to me I was never able to figure out. The men congregated on one side of the pool, shirtless, mustached, with protruding belly, cigarette in one hand, caipirinha in the other, offering vocal opinions on women, soccer, and politics, peppered with jokes that got dirtier as the alcohol level rose. On the opposite side of the pool, the women, suntanned in lounge chairs, chatting about problems with this or that aunt's maid, a new diet that really worked, or the latest family gossip. I recall the brouhaha when an uncle divorced his wife to marry his secretary, a huge scandal in this Catholic part of my mother's family that could have come straight out of one of the 3 evening telenovelas playing on the TV set in the living room at 5, 6, and 8 p.m., right? So these Brazilian soap operas. I never felt quite safe at the chácara. At any moment, an aunt could pull me to her bosom and cuddle me. I can still smell the mix of sweat, sun lotion, and perfume that these bosoms exuded. Or an uncle hit me jovially on the back. Hey, alemãozinho, little German, try to relax a little. My German stiffness seemed to entertain everyone. The climax of the weekend was the churrasco, the festive barbecue, where we would eat obscene amounts of meat goaded on by the rhythms of MPB, Música Popular Brasileira, so Brazilian pop music. The desserts were variations of sugar, chocolate, condensed milk, butter and eggs, followed by cafezinhos, a small coffee, with artificial sweetener for the adults. And I never quite got, how after these kinds of desserts, people would put artificial sweetener into their coffee. It never really made sense to me. In short, the chácara was my initiation into joie de vivre, Brazilian upper middle class style. Yet I did much prefer the chácara to our trips out to the sítio, a piece of land outside of São Paulo that my father had purchased, one of many attempts he made to realize his fantasy of a simple country life. I hated that place to which we drive out almost every weekend. Our house had no electricity. We would light kerosene lanterns after sunset. The water only ran when the gas fuel pump in the well was in a good mood. Otherwise, we had to pull up buckets. It was hot, humid, full of vermin, flies, mosquitoes, spiders, cockroaches, sometimes a snake or a scorpion. My siblings, by the way, really loved that place, but I hated it. My father, always on the lookout for an opportunity to do good, invited Seu Siverino, Mr. Siverino, a refugee from the drought in Brazil's northeast, to settle on our property. He arrived with his wife and 7 very hungry children. They would eat most of the fruits and vegetables, oranges, bananas, corn, manioc, before they were ripe, and then blame birds, locusts, and other animals for the loss of the harvest. Likewise, a mysterious illness prevented our chicken from laying eggs. I see, my father would say and wink at my mother, maybe we'll have better luck with the harvest next year. In school, we hadn't reached our teens yet when my new classmates started talking about romance and sex. As if, in addition to changing time zones from Germany to Brazil, my biological clock was expected to jump forward as well. I was at a loss, but at least understood that it was time to retire my water pistol, the only means my German friends and I had used to communicate with girls on the schoolyard. Quite a bit of a boy standing in class in São Paulo depended on the number of pubic hairs he could boast, a number that was scrupulously verified in the shower after gym class. I didn't do too well by that measure and soon found out that being good in math or Portuguese grammar did nothing to compensate for it. Another disconcerting discovery was that nobody had heard of Winnetou, Old Shatterhand, or any of my other childhood heroes. Instead, I was introduced to the characters of Monteiro Lobato's Sítio do Pica-Pau Amarelo, the farm of the yellow woodpecker, including Dona Benta and her 2 grandchildren, Lucia, known by her nickname Narizinho, Little Nose, because she has a turned-up nose, and her cousin Pedrinho, Nastasia, the black servant and cook, and 2 talking puppets, the ragdoll Emilia, animated by Dr. Snail's talking pills, which she had somehow ingested, and the Visconde de Sabugosa, an aristocratic lurid puppet made of corncob. I never grew very fond of those. But nothing epitomized shame and otherness more than my German sandals. Every morning I dreaded the moment after breakfast when I had to put them on. It's hot, my father, who was sort of this very rational person. It's hot, he would argue. You'll get sweaty feet and fungus in your sneakers. From these premises, the necessity to wear sandals followed without mercy. Once I tried to smuggle my sneakers out of the house, but my father noticed the unusual bump in my backpack. It's not that he couldn't see my torment, but logic was logic. Imagine what it looks like in your classmates' shoes, he said to comfort me. What he couldn't fathom was that I would have infinitely preferred to have itchy skin and toes full of blisters over being the only boy in sandals surrounded by super cool Nike high tops. I tried to make up for it by, through sport. Never again did I do so much of it: basketball, baseball, soccer, tennis, swimming, running, jumping, you name it. Yet I never got beyond mediocrity. In a sit-up competition at school, I once pushed myself to 75. The record was 93 after that. My abdominal muscles ached so much that it took me about a week to recover erect posture, right? I couldn't walk, like I had to walk like that. So every passerby, I imagined, was secretly laughing at me, the contorted German boy in sandals. In Germany, nobody had cared about my footwear. Perhaps that's why I felt that returning to Germany was my only hope for salvation. At this time of year, I would have been in my winter boots, sledding down a hill with my friends or throwing snowballs at girls, not dragging myself through the summer heat in the dreaded sandals. Clearly, the world was upside down. I longed desperately for Germany, clung to all things German, and put down all things Brazilian. I insisted on reading German books and kept writing letters back and forth with my former German classmates, even when I could hardly remember their faces anymore, many years. I went so far as to pester my parents to go to a German restaurant, the Juca Alemão in São Paulo, every couple of weeks. Nobody in my family was fond of Bratwurst, Schnitzel, Knödel, Salzkartoffeln, and the like, served by mulatto waiters in Bavarian leather trousers. But to stay connected, I insisted we had to force them down. My best friend was another German outsider, a twisted kid who cheated at every game we played. He did it shamelessly with a big grin on his face. The only thing he had going for him was being German. Bitching about Brazilians, unreliable, unpunctual, dishonest, loud, superficial, over lunch with his sister and parents offered rare moments of comfort. His home became a kind of sanctuary for me, the only place where I felt truly understood. I idolized his family, which seemed solid and coherent compared to mine. His father was an engineer for Volkswagen on temporary assignment in Brazil. He sported a buzz cut and had hobbies like building model ships and sailing. His mother cooked and kept the house in order. In São Paulo, the bourgeois lifestyle and bigoted judgment, which I fully endorsed, were as close to my lost paradise as I could get. Then, when I was 12, my tenacious German nationalism came to a screeching halt. One day, my grandparents simply lost patience and gave me a copy of Der gelbe Stern, the Yellow Star, a photo documentary of the Holocaust billed as the world's most shocking Bilderbuch, picture book. Like all German Jews in the circle, they rushed to get the book when it came out in 1960, thrilled to finally have incontrovertible proof of how depraved Germans were. I hadn't seen that punch coming. It blew to pieces what I had thought of as my world: Playmobil, Lego, Schultüte, and all. Under that world, I learned as I leafed through images of piled up glasses, suitcases, and gaunt bodies, lay buried 6 million murdered Jews. We never went back to the Juca Alemão, to this German restaurant in São Paulo. What compounded my already considerable confusion was that most people in my grandparents' circle felt no less estranged in Brazil than I did. My grandmother's prejudices against Brazilians uncannily resembled mine, even though she had lived there all her adult life. But, like a dirty secret, that generation of exiles kept their longing for Germany hidden. Suddenly I understood the embarrassed smiles and evasive answers I'd receive whenever I tried to share my enthusiasm for Germany on occasional visits to São Paulo's liberal synagogue, or when we joined my Jewish family on the Jewish holidays, the breaking of the fast after Yom Kippur, a Hanukkah party, or a Passover Seder, none of which at that time actually meant anything to me. These German Jews, I now realized, weren't the allies I'd assumed them to be. All of that made the question of where home was quite intractable for me. The world wasn't just upside down, I had kind of lost all sense of direction. In 1984, we did return to Germany. My father got a job as a math teacher in Braunschweig, which is a mid-sized town in Protestant Lower Saxony, not far from where the Iron Curtain divided the world into East and West, where the wall went by. In 1932, Hitler got German citizenship in Braunschweig, a key step in his rise to power. So it's a city with a certain notoriety. Even in 8th grade, I was relieved to discover boys still were wearing Birkenstock and Lederhosen. In school, I went back to reading German literature from the Nibelungenlied to Goethe's Faust, but my adulation of Germany had been knocked out of me. Now, after the surface German identity came apart, I tried hard to replace it. After high school, I worked in a favela in a slum in Brazil and studied Brazilian literature and history in São Paulo. Then I got a philosophy degree in Berlin, but this Maria Feen feeling of home was gone. Then, when I was in my early 20s, I decided that my best shot to recover that feeling was by moving to Israel. Do you celebrate the Jewish holidays? Such a question from an ill-humored El Al security agent, Berlin airport, fall of 1995. So I was 24 by then. Look at my passport, I said, trying for nonchalance, the chances of catching my flight to Tel Aviv quickly dwindling. I have a Jewish family name. That's not an answer. Do you celebrate the Jewish holidays? Cornered, not usually, I confessed. Is this a new passport? Why? Does it look forged? Well, it's provisional, I said, pointing to the admittedly cheap-looking interim German ID. I had applied too late for the passport, so I only had a sort of cheap-looking interim thing. But it's valid. Then came the words every traveler dreads. I'm afraid you have to come with me. The agent signaled for a colleague to bring my bags. The Zionist period of my life was off to a bad start. The room they took me to was guarded by German police officers in green uniforms, fingers around the triggers of their machine guns. The Israeli security personnel fired question after question, trying to make sure I wasn't a terrorist posing as a Jew. I felt hurt, as if this was a personal attack, not a safety measure. No, I could not name relatives in Israel. No, I did not have a bar mitzvah. Even the removal of my foreskin hadn't been kosher. I had been circumcised in hospital. Please, just leave me alone. I was 24 and full of hope that the Jewish state might finally be the home I was looking for. Instead, in their bid to figure out if I was planning to hijack or blow up the airplane, the agents poked hole after hole into my already flimsy Jewish identity. Now, nobody on the Jewish side of my family had ever been to Israel. As assimilated German Jews, they first opposed Zionism, then after the Holocaust they supported it, but without passion. My own idea of Israel was rather peculiar, a country full of intellectuals wearing small round glasses, meeting in cafes, synagogues, and at dinner parties to debate big existential, political, religious, and philosophical questions. The Israel of my imagination at the time was modeled on the Jews who mattered to me. Franz Kafka, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt. So I thought it was a country full of Kafkas, Benjamins, and Arendts. The security agents finally let me go, exhausted, scared, my confidence badly shaken. A week later, I was renting a room in the apartment of an elderly Polish-Jewish lady in Rehavia, one of the oldest quarters in West Jerusalem, known as the quarters of the professors because many European academics and intellectuals settled there. You may know it from Amos Oz's Memoir and the film based on it. So it plays there in Rehavia. Rivka was a labor Zionist who had worked most of her life in a kibbutz. When I told her I was German, she listed the names of a dozen family members who had been murdered in the Holocaust. An awkward silence followed until I realized that she was waiting for me to apologize. Oh, I said, embarrassed, I'm not part of that Germany. And I thought, you know, great, first I'm a terrorist at the airport, now a Nazi descendant. After I explained that my family was Jewish, Rivka wanted to know if I was fond of Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine. Didn't your Babi cook these things? Babi? You don't know what Babi means? I shook my head, feeling again embarrassed. It's grandmother in Yiddish. I had a hard time reconciling what I knew of my urban, elegant, chain-smoking grandmother in São Paulo with the image of a headscarf-wearing Babi lighting Shabbos candles in a Polish shtetl. As for cooking, the first thing that came to mind was goiabada with queijo de Minas, guava paste with white cheese from Minas Gerais, café con leite, and freshly squeezed orange juice, the breakfast my grandmother prepared for me when I stayed with her and my grandfather in Brazil after high school. Rivka's chicken soup with krepelach, dumplings, was fine, but I almost choked on the chopped liver and the gefilte fish that followed. Lots of horseradish and a glass of red wine helped me gulp them down. How do you like it, she asked. I love it. I lied politely, desperate to prove that there was a Jew in me after all. From then on, I got a plate with gefilte fish every week. I had to make up an excuse to eat them in my room, where I would feed them to her cats through the window. The Israel of my imagination, I soon discovered, had very little in common with reality. There was no grand philosophical debating club. Instead of Athens, right, ancient Athens, a city of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, Israel reminded me more of Sparta, a country where courage is praised above all. Serving in the Israeli Defense Forces is a core feature of Israeli identity. I soon got used to the machine guns dangling from people's shoulders everywhere. Religious matters, too, seem pretty straightforward. For the average observant Jew, God had chosen the Jewish people and revealed his will in form of the Torah. Studying the Torah and living by its precepts brings reward. Neglecting to do so, punishment. Most religious Israelis were also Zionists. Nobody seemed especially keen to debate Walter Benjamin, Franz Kafka, or Hannah Arendt with me. The Talmud, I hoped, would finally unlock for me the essence of Judaism, so I registered for an introductory class at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The Babylonian Talmud, which reached its final form in the 7th century of the Common Era, is the main work, the magnum opus of rabbinic Judaism, as you know. Weighing in at about 6,000 pages, it explores every detail of God's law as it was supposedly revealed to Moses. It begins with the question of how many stars must be visible for reciting the evening prayer, and ends with an intricate discussion of the impurity caused by menstruation. Of those 6,000 pages, we got through 6 in a year. At that pace, it would take me 1,000 years to read the Talmud from cover to cover. Even if I wanted to, I realized it was mathematically impossible for me to become a Talmud-trained Jew. The vigorous debate and subtle dialectic impressed me, as did the deliberately open-ended form, not dogmatic teaching, but an invitation to join the discussion. But that invitation, I quickly realized, was not for me. Almost none of the 613 divine commandments spoke to me, and the few that did, don't kill, don't steal, I observed without God's authority. The fundamental idea of submitting to God's will was foreign to me. It dawned on me that the idea of Judaism I'd concocted, based on this or that serendipitous reading, didn't match the Judaism, the rigorous Judaism of the traditional Talmud school. Looking back, I can only scratch my head. My family had been secular over 4 generations, in part militantly so. They'd have dismissed the idea of seeking salvation by observing God's commandments as superstition, if not opium, for the people. Yet here I was, trying to find myself by laboring through a few paragraphs of Talmud in Jerusalem. These mishaps, though, didn't deter me. In time, my Hebrew got so good I could pass myself off as an Israeli. With so many immigrants, a little bit of accent didn't arouse suspicion. And in a bout of Zionist enthusiasm, I even decided to write my PhD thesis in Hebrew, which is the basis of my first book. And I think the reason why very few people actually read the first book, but it makes for an exotic item in my bibliography. I also learned to behave like the locals, direct, unapologetic, and when necessary with chutzpah, no more white lies like the one that got me a weekly portion of gefilte fish. People here, I felt, had real problems: war and terrorism, the secular religious divide, the legacy of the Holocaust, 2,000 years of persecution. I relished what looked like objective challenges, a relief from my Berlin student life, where I had been mired in this tortuous search for meaning. In my 2nd and 3rd year, I shared an apartment with Israeli students. The cafe we'd sometimes go to for a beer in the evening got blown up, as did a bus on the line I took to the university. I cheered when the 2nd Oslo Accords were signed, and cried when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, right, so in the 1990s here. In the elections that followed, I firmly supported Shimon Peres against Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi is still there, hanging on, more than 20 years later. I read the left liberal newspaper Haaretz every day, dated an Israeli girl, bargained at the Shuk, the Machaneh Yehuda market, like the locals, and tricked the boredom of Shabbat with movies at the Cinematheque, one of the few hangouts of Jerusalem's secular crowd. From the Cinematheque's terrace, I could overlook the old city walls. Even a trip to the West Bank didn't discourage me. These were all in all optimistic times, times of smiles and handshakes for the cameras. What drew me to this Israel so different from how I had first pictured it? Most of all, I wanted to be part of something, a religion, a community, a functioning family. I observed with wonder and envy Israeli families where parents and children were at ease with each other, as if being together was a matter of course. This love story, however, was doomed to fail. There are only two paths to genuine membership in Israel, the synagogue and the army. In the beginning, when I was still flirting with religion, I'd gone a few times to synagogue in my neighborhood. People were friendly enough, but it quickly became clear to me that I could not reinvent myself as a religious Jew. It had neither been part of my upbringing, nor was it intellectually meaningful to me. I was entitled to Israeli citizenship, but how useful is an Israeli passport if you didn't grow up there and didn't serve in the army? If, in other words, you lacked the defining experiences of Israel's national identity. People would get impatient with me after a while when I would reply that I was German but not really, Brazilian but not really, Jewish but not really. And now you really want to live in Israel, they'd ask, as if the idea was somehow strange. After spending 3 years in Jerusalem, I had to admit to myself that I had accomplished an interesting feast. In the land of the traditionally, at least, rootless, I had been unable to put down roots. It was quite devastating. Israel had been my last hope to find, sort of a location. Instead of becoming a citizen, I left feeling like the wandering Über-Jew. And I actually came directly from Jerusalem to Montreal, where I got my first academic job. So that's where this story continues. But so this is basically sort of a sketch of this sort of search for a place that ultimately failed, and that then many years later gave rise to this project of sort of recovering the family history and trying to sort of at least get a certain amount of self-clarification out of it. Anyway, so that's I think all that I wanted to share today. So basically the problem, how the problem emerged that this family history is supposed to solve. Thank you so much for listening.